I knew the exact moment I'd had enough. It was the sound of my mother's voice, sharp and cold, slicing through the air like a blade. "You're useless, just like your father." I should have been used to it. It wasn't the first time she'd said it, and I doubted it'd be the last. But something inside me cracked that night. I stood in the dimly lit kitchen, the smell of burned rice clinging to the air. My hands clenched around the dish towel, knuckles white. My mother sat at the table, a glass of cheap whiskey in her hand, her eyes narrowed in disgust. "You can't even cook a damn meal right," she muttered, taking a slow sip. I swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in my throat. I was 25, working 2 jobs to keep a roof over both our heads, and yet, in her eyes, I was still nothing. A disappointment. I glanced at my younger brother, Ethan, sitting across from her, his head down, shoulders hunched. He was only 16, and I had spent years shielding him from this, taking every cruel word so he wouldn't have to. But lately, I could see it. He was starting to believe her. Starting to believe that we were nothing. I couldn't let that happen. A crash echoed through the kitchen as my mother slammed her glass down. "Are you deaf, Lisa?" I said. "Clean this up." My vision blurred, my ears rang. Something inside me whispered enough. I moved to the sink, turning on the water, trying to drown out the boiling rage inside me. I wanted to scream, to throw the dish towel in her face, to demand why I was never enough for her. But I didn't, because I knew how this played out. I'd seen it 1,000 times before. I cleaned in silence, swallowing my anger like I always did. Until I heard her say it again, this time to Ethan. "Your sister's a failure, and you will be too. It runs in the family." My hands stopped scrubbing. I turned around slowly, heart pounding. "Say that again." My mother's lips curled into a smirk. "What, you gonna cry?" Pathetic. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between us. "Lisa, don't." But I was already walking toward her. For years, I had let her words sink into my skin like poison, let them dictate how I saw myself. But not him. Not my little brother. "I am not a failure." My voice shook, but I kept going. "And neither is Ethan." She laughed, actually laughed, like I had just told the funniest joke in the world. "Oh, honey, if you weren't such a screw-up, maybe your father wouldn't have walked out on us." I stopped breathing. The room was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I felt the weight of her words crash over me, pressing against my ribs, threatening to suffocate me. And then something clicked. I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't trapped here. I had been the one keeping this house together, making sure there was food on the table, making sure Ethan had a chance at a future. It had always been me. I met her gaze, my hands trembling with something I had never felt before, absolute clarity. "You're right," I said softly. "I am like Dad." She raised an eyebrow, caught off guard. I exhaled, my decision made in an instant. "Because I'm leaving, just like he did." For the first time in my life, my mother looked stunned. Ethan's head snapped up. "Wait, what?" "I can't do this anymore," I whispered. "I won't." My mother scoffed. "You won't last a day without me." I almost laughed. Without her? I had been surviving despite her. I turned to Ethan, my chest tightening. "Come with me." His eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw something flicker in them, hope. But before he could answer, my mother shot up from her chair, knocking over her glass. "He's not going anywhere." Ethan shrank back. Years of conditioning had made him believe he didn't have a choice. But he did. I looked at him, really looked at him. "You don't have to stay here, Ethan. You don't." Tears welled in his eyes. His lips parted, and I saw his hesitation, his fear. I wanted to promise him that leaving would be easy, that everything would be okay. But I couldn't, because I didn't know if it would be. All I knew was that staying here meant drowning. And I was done drowning. I took a step toward the door. "I'm leaving tonight." Ethan's hands curled into fists, his whole body shaking. My mother sneered. "If you walk out that door, don't ever come back." I held her gaze, feeling the weight of a lifetime of pain pressing down on me. And then I let it go. Good. With that, I turned and walked away, not stopping, not looking back. I didn't know where I was going. I had no plan, no safety net. But for the first time in my life, I was free. and I was never coming back. The cold air hit me the moment I stepped outside, but I barely felt it. My heartbeat was a war drum in my chest, my hands shaking from something that wasn't fear, something closer to adrenaline, to rage that had been buried for too long. I walked fast, my legs moving on instinct, my thoughts a tangled mess of what now? Where do I go? But one thing was clear, I wasn't going back. The streets were nearly empty, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. I didn't have my phone, my wallet, or even a jacket. I had walked out with nothing, but I couldn't regret it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. A noise behind me made me stop. Footsteps. I turned, my chest tightening, and there he was, Ethan. His hoodie was pulled up over his head, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face pale in the dim light. He was out of breath, like he had been running. "I'm coming with you." I stared at him, my brain refusing to process his words. I had hoped, but I hadn't expected it. I had seen the way our mother had her claws in him, the way years of her words had coiled around his spine, making him too afraid to stand. But he had run. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded, his jaw set, his hands gripping the straps of his bag like he was afraid I'd tell him to go back. "If I stay, she wins." His voice was quieter now, but there was something in it, something I hadn't heard in years, conviction. "I don't want to be like her, Lisa." "I can't." A breath I didn't realize I had been holding escaped me, and I grabbed his arm, gripping it tight like I needed to be sure he was real. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Okay." We started walking. We had nowhere to go, no plan, but the city stretched out in front of us like an open wound, and for the first time, we weren't trapped. I didn't let myself think about how unprepared we were, how impossible this might be. I couldn't. But the reality hit fast. An hour later, we were sitting on the steps outside an all-night laundromat, the neon sign buzzing faintly overhead. My fingers were numb, my stomach empty, and Ethan looked just as exhausted as I felt. "We need a place to stay," he muttered, pulling his hoodie tighter around himself. I exhaled sharply, pressing my palms against my forehead. I know. There weren't many options. I could have called a friend, but the truth was, I didn't have any close enough to ask for something like this. Not when I had spent so many years pretending everything was fine. There were shelters, but they filled up fast, and I didn't know which ones were safe. I had some money in my bank account, but not enough for a motel. Ethan shifted beside me. "What about Dad?" The words hit me harder than they should have. I hadn't seen our father in over a decade. He had left when I was 12, disappearing into another life, another city. I had stopped hoping he would come back. Stopped wondering if he ever thought about us. I hesitated. "I don't even know where he is." Ethan reached into his backpack and pulled out his phone. "I do." I blinked at him, my chest tightening. "How?" I looked him up, he admitted, not meeting my eyes. "A while ago." I stared at him, 1,000 emotions crashing into me at once. Hurt, disbelief, something dangerously close to hope. "And you didn't tell me?" Ethan's fingers tightened around his phone. "Would you have wanted to know?" I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. He handed me the phone, and I stared at the address on the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. He wasn't that far. A couple of hours by bus. A lifetime away in every other way. I let out a shaky breath. "You really think he'll help us?" Ethan didn't look sure. "I don't know. But we don't have anywhere else to go." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say that we didn't need him, that we had made it this far without him, that he had no right to be the person we turned to now. But I was too tired to fight the truth. We had no other choice. I stood up, rubbing my arms for warmth. "Then let's go." The bus station was a few blocks away, the streets quiet, the world asleep around us. Every step felt heavier than the last. I kept glancing at Ethan, at the way his face stayed tense, like he was bracing for disappointment. I knew that feeling too well. When we finally got on the bus, the heat blasting from the vents made me realize how cold I had been. Ethan sat beside me, staring out the window, his reflection barely visible against the dark glass. I wanted to say something to him, to tell him that no matter what happened, I was proud of him for walking away. But the words felt too big, too heavy for the moment. The ride was long. Too long. By the time we stepped off the bus, the sky was beginning to lighten, streaks of pale blue creeping over the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet, rows of houses standing still in the early morning hush. I checked the address again, my fingers trembling slightly. This was it. We walked up to the house, our footsteps almost too loud in the silence. My stomach twisted. My throat felt tight. I had imagined seeing him again 1,000 times, but never like this. Ethan looked at me. You okay? No, not even close. But I nodded anyway. I lifted my hand and knocked. Seconds passed. Then more. My heart pounded. And then the door opened. And there he was. Our father. Older. More tired. But still unmistakably him. His eyes flickered between us, widening slightly, like he wasn't sure if we were real. Then, finally, he spoke. Lisa? The sound of my name in his voice, sent a shock through my system. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Ethan was the one who answered. We need your help. Our father exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might tell us to leave. That he might say he didn't have room for us in his new life. But instead, he stepped aside. Come in. I wasn't sure if we were making a mistake. But we had nowhere else to go. And for now, that was enough. The door clicked shut behind us, and just like that, we were inside. The house smelled different from what I expected, clean, faintly like coffee, with none of the stale alcohol or cigarette smoke that clung to our mother's home. The walls were lined with shelves, neat but lived in, and there was a framed picture on a side table that caught my eye. A woman. Blonde. Smiling. And standing beside her, our father. I barely recognized him up close. His face was thinner, his hair more gray than brown, and there were lines on his forehead that hadn't been there when I was 12. He looked at us with something unreadable in his eyes, something caught between guilt and disbelief, but he wasn't saying anything. Neither were we. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until he finally exhaled and motioned for us to sit. Ethan dropped onto the couch immediately, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, but I stayed standing. My muscles were too tense, too coiled. Being here didn't feel real yet. I could still hear my mother's voice in my head, spitting his name like a curse. Your father didn't care. Your father walked out on us. Your father. He ran a hand through his hair, still watching us. It's been a long time. I swallowed hard, forcing down the bitterness that rose in my throat. Yeah, it has. More silence. He looked at Ethan, his expression softening slightly. You were just a kid last time I saw you. Ethan shrugged, avoiding his gaze. Still a kid. Dad nodded slowly, like he wasn't sure what to say to that. He turned back to me. Why are you here? The question landed harder than I expected. I knew it was coming, but it still sent a jolt through me. I wanted to throw the question back at him, to demand why he had never come looking for us, but I was too tired for that fight. I just wanted an answer. I wanted to know if we had made a mistake coming here. I folded my arms tightly over my chest. We left. His eyes darkened slightly. Left. I nodded. Mom. The house. Everything. His jaw tightened at that, but he didn't look surprised. I wondered if he had always known it would come to this, if he had expected that one day we'd show up at his door because we had nowhere else to go. You walked out. She gave us no choice, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I couldn't take it anymore. His expression shifted, but I couldn't tell if it was regret or something else. He sat down in the chair across from us, rubbing his palms together like he was trying to warm them. How bad did it get? Ethan let out a dry, humorless laugh. Bad enough. Dad's gaze flickered between us again, taking in the exhaustion, the way we were sitting like we weren't sure if we belonged here. He sighed, leaning back. How long have you been out? I glanced at the clock on the wall. Since last night. He frowned. You've been on the streets? Not by choice, I muttered. His fingers drummed against the armrest. I could see the thoughts racing through his head, calculations, decisions. I had no idea if he was about to tell us to leave, or if he was trying to figure out how to make room for us in whatever life he had now. Finally, he nodded. You can stay here. For now. Something in my chest unclenched, just slightly. Thank you. Ethan exhaled like he had been holding his breath. Dad stood and walked toward the kitchen, pulling open a cabinet. You two must be starving. I hadn't even realized how hungry I was until that moment. The last thing I had eaten was a piece of burnt toast before Mom started yelling about the rice. Now, the gnawing emptiness in my stomach felt unbearable. Ethan perked up slightly. You got anything good? Dad smirked, the first real expression I had seen from him. Depends. You still hate vegetables. Ethan made a face. Obviously. Dad shook his head, grabbing a loaf of bread and some peanut butter from the shelf. Figures. For a few minutes, everything almost felt normal. He made us sandwiches, and we ate in the kitchen, the air a little less suffocating than before. But underneath it all, the questions were still there. The things we weren't saying. The things we needed to say. When we finished, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed. How much money do you have? I winced. Not much. I was gonna get paid next week, but, you know. He nodded like he understood, but there was something else in his eyes now. Hesitation. I braced myself. What? He sighed. Lisa, I need you to understand something. I'll help you, but this can't be permanent. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I mean I have my own life here. I can let you stay for a while, but you need a plan. A plan. Right. Like I had time to make one before everything fell apart. Ethan looked between us, his expression tightening. So what, you're just gonna kick us out? Dad shook his head. No, but you need to figure out your next steps. This isn't a long-term fix. A bitter laugh escaped me. Unbelievable. His eyes darkened. Lisa. No, I snapped. I get it. You left us behind once. Why would this be any different? His face hardened, but I didn't care. The exhaustion, the frustration, the years of abandonment were boiling over now, spilling out of me before I could stop them. You say this isn't permanent, but you were never even temporary, I spat. You walked away. You didn't check on us. You let her tear us apart, and now you're acting like this is a favor. He exhaled sharply. You don't know what you're talking about. I laughed, shaking my head. Then tell me. Tell me. Where the hell were you? Ethan shifted beside me, looking uncomfortable, but I was past caring. I had spent years burying this anger, pushing it down because it didn't matter. But it did matter. It always had. Dad rubbed a hand down his face. I thought leaving was the best thing I could do. I froze. What? His voice was lower now, quieter. I knew if I stayed, I'd just make things worse. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. She made sure I was the villain, no matter what I did. I didn't have the money to fight for custody. I didn't have a way to take care of you too. And I thought, maybe if I was gone, she'd let up. I swallowed hard. She didn't. He looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw real regret. Real pain. I know. Ethan stared at his hands. So what now? Dad didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he said, now, we figure it out. I wanted to believe him, but I wasn't sure if I could. For the next few days, we stayed. It felt temporary, like we were visitors in someone else's life, like we were intruding. Dad didn't act like he minded, but there was always a slight stiffness in his posture, a hesitation in his voice whenever we asked for something. I tried not to care. I told myself that we just needed time to get back on our feet, that we weren't here to be his problem. But that didn't stop the unease from creeping in every time I caught him looking at us like we were ghosts from a past he thought he had left behind. Ethan adjusted quicker than I did. He spent most of his time in the living room, watching TV or scrolling through his phone. He was quieter than usual, but I could see the weight on his shoulders easing, the way he didn't flinch at sudden sounds, the way he actually let himself relax. And that was enough to keep me from leaving. At least for now. On the third night, Dad brought it up again. I was in the kitchen, rinsing off a plate when he leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Lisa, we need to talk about what's next. I dried my hands on a dish towel, already bracing for the conversation I didn't want to have. I'm looking for a job. He nodded, but his expression didn't change. That's a start. But what about Ethan? I tensed. What about him? He needs stability. He needs school. He needs more than just running from one place to another. I exhaled sharply. I know that. Do you? His voice wasn't cruel, but it was firm. Because right now, it feels like you're just trying to survive day by day. I gripped the counter behind me, fighting back my frustration. That's all we've ever done. His eyes flickered with something regret, maybe, or shame, but he didn't look away. I want to help, but you need to let me. I hesitated, my heart pounding. And what does that mean? His jaw tightened. I've been talking to someone. A lawyer. About custody. A sharp, cold shock went through me. Custody? For Ethan, he clarified. If we go to court, if we can prove your mother's unfit, I can take him in legally. I stared at him, my chest tightening. It should have been good news. It should have been exactly what I wanted. But something about it made me feel like the floor was tilting under me. And what about me? Dad hesitated. Lisa, you're an adult. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Right. So Ethan gets to be saved, but I just figure it out on my own. That's not what I'm saying. No, I snapped. Because it sure as hell sounds like it. You're finally stepping up, but only for him. Not me. His face darkened. That's not fair. Fair? I let out a shaky breath, my hands curling into fists. Do you know how hard I fought to keep us together? Do you know what I went through to make sure Ethan didn't grow up thinking he was nothing? I raised him. I did that. Not you. Dad's expression cracked, just slightly, but I wasn't done. You think you can just show up now and be the hero? That you can fix things with a lawyer and a custody agreement? Where were you when we needed you most? Silence. He rubbed a hand over his face, his shoulders slumping. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. I don't have an excuse. I should have fought harder. I should have come back. He looked at me then, really looked at me. But I can't change the past, Lisa. All I can do is try to make things right now. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But belief didn't erase the years of absence, the nights I spent wondering why I wasn't worth fighting for. And now he wanted to take Ethan in, to finally be a father, just without me. I swallowed, my throat burning. What if I don't want to be apart from him? Dad held my gaze. Then stay. The words knocked the air from my lungs. Stay. Like it was that easy. Like I could just forget everything, like I could settle into this new version of him, of us, and pretend it didn't feel like too little, too late. I shook my head. I don't know if I can do that. He nodded slowly, like he had expected that answer. Just think about it. I did. For hours. I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Ethan breathing in the next room. I knew what the right choice was. Staying meant stability. It meant giving Ethan a real shot at a future. It meant having a roof over my head, at least for now. But staying also meant trusting Dad, believing that he wouldn't let us down again. I wasn't sure I could do that. The next morning, I made a decision. I waited until Dad left for work, until Ethan was still asleep, and then I packed my bag. It wasn't much, just some clothes, a few things I had borrowed from Dad's house, a little cash I had managed to scrape together. I didn't have a real plan, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let anyone decide my future for me. I scribbled a note on the back of a receipt and left it on the kitchen table. Ethan, I love you, but I can't stay. You deserve a real home, a real shot at something better, and if Dad can give you that, I won't take it from you. But I need to figure out who I am outside of all this. I'll call you when I can. Don't hate me. Lisa. I stared at the words for a long time, my hands shaking, before I forced myself to walk to the door. I didn't look back. Not when I stepped outside. Not when I crossed the street. Not even when I heard the faint sound of Ethan calling my name from inside the house. I kept walking. And this time, I wasn't running away. I was choosing myself. The first night alone was the hardest. I found a cheap motel on the edge of town and paid for a single night with most of what I had. The room was small, the air stale, the sheets rough beneath my fingers. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my body exhausted, but my mind refusing to shut off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face when he found the note. I imagined him reading it, his hands shaking, his mouth pressing into that tight, familiar line he always did when he was trying not to fall apart. He would be angry. Hurt. Maybe he'd hate me for leaving. I squeezed my eyes shut, swallowing the guilt down. This was the right decision. It had to be. Morning came too fast. I had no job, no plan, and less than $30 to my name. The city stretched out in front of me, unfamiliar and indifferent, and for the first time since I left home, real fear crept in. I wasn't stupid. I knew how easily people fell through the cracks. I had spent years watching my mother hover on the edge of ruin, always one missed bill away from disaster. I refused to end up like that. I spent the day searching for work, walking until my feet ached. Every rejection felt like a punch to the ribs. No experience, no openings, no luck. By evening, I was down to my last few dollars, and the motel wasn't an option anymore. I needed somewhere to sleep. The shelter was nearly full by the time I arrived. The air inside was thick with exhaustion, people huddled in corners, their faces hollow with stories I would never know. I kept my head down, folding into myself, ignoring the way the reality of my situation pressed against my ribs like a weight I couldn't shake. This wasn't a temporary setback. This was survival. The next week blurred together. I found a diner willing to take a chance on me, the kind of place that didn't ask too many questions as long as you showed up on time and worked hard. The pay was barely enough to get by, but it was something. I found a room to rent, a cramped space above a laundromat with a mattress on the floor and a window that barely opened. It wasn't home, but it was mine. I didn't call Ethan. I wanted to. Every night I stared at my phone, my fingers hovering over his name. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. If he was safe, if he was settling into a life that wasn't built on fear and survival, then I wouldn't drag him back into mine. 2 weeks passed before the number flashed across my screen. Ethan. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My hands trembled as I picked up. His voice was quiet. Lisa. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. Hey. Silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we hadn't said. Then he exhaled, a shaky, uneven sound. You really left. I swallowed hard. Yeah. Another pause. I could hear the slight hum of a TV in the background, the faint clatter of dishes. He was still at Dad's. That was good. You should have told me, he said finally. His voice wasn't angry, just tired. I rubbed a hand over my face. I didn't want you to try and stop me. You think I would have? I don't know. More silence. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I miss you. A lump formed in my throat. I miss you too. His breathing was uneven, like he was holding something back. Dad's different from what I thought. I hesitated. Good different or bad different? He let out a small, hollow laugh. Both, I think. He tries, but I can tell he doesn't know how to be around me. Around us. I closed my eyes, guilt twisting in my stomach. He'll figure it out. I guess. A pause. Then, are you okay? I wanted to lie. To tell him I had everything figured out, that I was happy, that leaving had been the easiest thing in the world. But he deserved better than that. I don't know yet. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady. You will be. Something in my chest cracked. He had spent his whole life looking up to me, following my lead. But for the first time, it felt like he was the one holding me together. I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. Yeah. I think so too. Neither of us said goodbye. We just sat there, breathing, existing, knowing that no matter how much had changed, we still had each other. For the first time in my life, that was enough. And maybe that's what freedom really is, not running away, not starting over, but finally choosing yourself without apology.